Thank you, Mike, and thank you for the nice introduction, and welcome everybody. As Mike said, we've got innovation on the brain, and especially at this time of year, and we've had that sparked by our guest today, Gary Shapiro. Gary is, as many know here at the Milken Institute, near and dear to our hearts because we know what it takes to stage a big event with a lot of moving parts, as happens every year with our global conference in the spring. And we tip our caps to the man who successfully pulls off the mother of all blockbuster trade shows and industry conferences. Really extraordinary. As president and CEO of the Consumer Electronics Association, a U.S. trade association that represents over 2,000 consumer electronics companies, it's perhaps best known for owning and producing the continent's largest annual trade show, the International Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. How many people here have been to CES? If you haven't been to CES, it's extraordinary. If you want to know what the future is, you really only need to go to one place at what time of the year, and you can actually see it and touch it.
It's a great line. I want to use that.
If you've got a DVR or home set to record your favorite TV show, if you've got a smartphone in your pocket, you probably bought a product that made its debut at CES. I don't know how many tens of thousands of industry leaders and content providers come to Las Vegas for a glimpse of the future, as we called it. It's really a who's who of technology in the consumer technology and high-tech industries, as well as buyers, journalists, financial analysts, who all come together to determine what the next big thing is. The last 2 years have seen an explosion in new products, tablets, Android devices, smart appliances, and even the debut of the electric version of the Ford Focus. The Ford Focus. Beyond producing CES, Gary has led the industry through several seismic shifts, including its successful transition to HD TV, no small accomplishment. As chairman of the Home Recording Rights Coalition, he also led the manufacturers' battle to preserve the legality of recording technology and consumer fair use rights. For all of us who record and replay shows, we owe Gary a debt of gratitude. It was a fight. It was not easy. Gary is a member of the board of directors of the Northern Virginia Technology Council, the State Department's Advisory Committee on International Communications and Information Policy, and he's also a member of the board of directors of the Washington Economic Club. He's testified before Congress on technology and business issues more than 20 times, and he's now the author, and this is what we've come together to talk about, of a New York Times bestseller, The Comeback: How Innovation Will Restore the American Dream. The book's foreword was written by Mark Cuban, everyone's favorite shrinking violet sports owner. Few people are more qualified to speak about technology-led change than Gary. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Gary.
Pleasure. So, Gary, you and I had the opportunity to talk once on the phone before coming. We decided that was a good idea because we would keep things fresh. But I just want to tell you, in reading your book, and I have to tell you, there was a real reticence to begin with on my part, because sometimes books on innovation, in America at least, are disconnected from reality. They talk about innovation in a very sort of ethereal and not in ways that don't apply to policy as well as how businesses are run. Your book is, I would say, the direct opposite of that. It is completely and totally grounded. And I want to congratulate you on giving us real actionable steps to bring America back to a place where you think it should be. Where should America be in terms of our ability to create jobs via innovation and innovation in general?
Thank you. First of all, thanks for having me, and thanks all of you for coming to take time out of your day to listen to something that may be a little different. It's important for our future, and I want to back up a little bit because there's so many different ways I could approach this. But what really inspired me to write the book is something personal, which isn't in the book. And that is that I am 55 years old. When I was 50 or 48, I got remarried, and to a woman who had never been married before. She was 40. And we were married for a few years, and shockingly, which wasn't our intent, she got pregnant. So there I am at, I think, 52 years old, and all of a sudden my wife is pregnant. She's working full-time. I'm working full-time. Believe it or not, we live in different cities still. And yeah, it's crazy. The question is, you know, it's not only whether she wanted to have the baby. Is it fair to have a baby when you're as old at that age? Which I didn't realize. When I first had a set of kids, you just did it because you were young. That's what you do, and you don't think about it really. Because you're supposed to do that. Well, the second round, you realize how tiring it is. And we had to think about it. And I realized that I'm not going to be around for a good portion of my son's life. So that tells you the story. We had a son, and he's now 3. But you owe something to your kids. And it got me thinking, that not only do we owe something to our kids, but we're at a time where the next generation may not really have it as well as we did in some ways. Certainly it'll have better technology. They will have better innovation. But they may not have a better life as an American. And it was because, in part, that we are the first generation of Americans, my generation, are the first generation that have taken a different tack. Instead of sacrificing for our children, we've essentially taken from our children. We've borrowed from them. And the whole concept of sacrifice was something that my parents, my grandparents who were immigrants, that's what they did. And it was for us. So it's something that really had me think, and I realized that if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So what really motivated me to start putting pen to paper and doing that was that number one. Number two, we have an event in China every year. And they treat me really well there, and I could tell you a lot of stories, and it's fun. But about 4 years ago, around perhaps the same time my wife was pregnant, I'm sitting next, I went through a whole bunch of, they're called protocol meetings. We sit next to each other. There's a table behind us. There's flowers. There's interpreters behind us. Everyone's lined up on either side according to who they're with and what their rank is. And all day long through these protocol meetings, instead of the happy meetings I was used to, all I kept hearing was Chinese, 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 then subprime mortgage, Chinese, Chinese. And what was happening was they were all upset with us because we caused problems for them. They weren't making their ambitious sales goals. And they were taking that on us. And these are company leaders, government leaders throughout the day. At the end of the day, I finally got it. You know, I heard the subprime mortgage, and I said, I have great news for you. You know what? Our entire delegation of CEOs, we screened every one of them. Not one of them has a subprime mortgage. So that, we so he stood English. But actually, that night it was the big banquet, 1,000 people, lots of performers, lots of great things. But I'm sitting next to the top communist official for the province. This province has 110 million people. An important person, doesn't speak any English, definitely old school communist. And he goes like this to me. With the interpreters were not there for some reason, sitting behind us. He goes like this. He goes, China going up. And I shook my head and I agreed. I mean, there's cranes everywhere. Everything is new. They're growing by leaps and bounds. It's very impressive. And I agreed. But then he goes, this. He goes, U.S. going down. And you know, all my life I haven't been the most patriotic person, but that flipped a switch. I mean, I didn't punch him. I didn't do anything. I just excused myself. I went to talk to one of my board members who calmed me down. But that stayed with me, and it had an impression. So the third part of the story, I know maybe taking too much time.
It's good.
This book, actually, I have to confess, is not my. I mean, I wrote it and I had an editor, but it is not owned by me. It's owned by the Consumer Electronics Association. I don't make a penny additional over it because of it, but it is owned by the association because our board, actually, at a board meeting, we said, let's forget the agenda for a second. What is the most important thing for the technology industry in the United States 5 to 10 years from now? We just started our meeting talking about that. And immediately there was agreement that the most important thing is the health of the US economy. So the next question is, well, how will we be doing as a country in 5 to 10 years? And immediately every one of these CEOs sitting around the table said, terribly. So the question is, why? They said, well, because we're doing things wrong as a nation. And that provoked a discussion about what's right and what's wrong and what we should be doing. And from that moment on, we shifted our focus. Instead of focusing in just our industry and just what's important, we said, what's important to the future of the nation? And the conclusion was this. We are in deep, deep financial trouble. There's no question about it because it's all math, as President Obama said on Monday. It's just math. You just have to lay out Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, everything, and it's not sustainable. So when you're in that amount of trouble, you have three choices, and they're not mutually exclusive. You could cut spending, which is not fun and difficult. You could raise taxes, which is not fun and difficult. And or you can grow. Growth only comes from innovation. Well, certainly that's ending wars. That is cutting spending. And look, I was excited that President Obama would do that, and he hasn't. So whatever it is, I don't control that. But what I do have some ability to talk about and influence is growth. And growth only comes from innovation. And one of the reasons that President Clinton and the Congress at the time did a great job in balancing our budget was we were at a very fast growth. The internet was just starting. A lot of good things were happening. And the question is, how do we get back there? And what's really scary to me is even all these discussions that are going on in Washington now, today, as we speak, they're all assuming a level of growth which we're not even making this year. Their assumptions are very, very Pollyannish. So how do we get to growth? How do we get to innovation? And when you look at innovation, and when you look at who we are and what we are, innovation is our competitive strength, and it's who we are. And I'm happy to talk about that more if you want.
Well, we will. And also, we'll do Q&A at the end of the interview, please. Gary, before you get there, though, you have to talk about the relative importance of innovation in the entire American economy. So, you know, where do you see it? What's the history behind innovation and its role in the U.S. economy?
Well, innovation is, I mean, you can look at the different things that we introduced to the world in our relatively short history, and it's quite phenomenal. And there's a long list, and I won't bore you with it, but there's a lot of great things, and they do change. The internet is probably the best example in our lifetime of a phenomenal, fundamental change, which has changed the world. But even before the internet, you know, just take one company. You think I'm going to say Apple. I'm going to say Microsoft, because Microsoft has fundamentally changed how we process and deal with information, how we create things through some of their products. Or you could take Google. You could take Apple. You could take so many, any company connected with the internet is an American company, one form or the other. Semiconductors, almost the same thing. Biotechnology. Healthcare, despite the healthcare debate, and I'm sure everyone has different views on that, there was one premise which was totally wrong, and that was somehow healthcare in this country isn't good because compared to developed countries, we have higher mortality rates, lower birth weights for children. We are the most heterogeneous country in the world, and we're being compared to homogeneous countries. We have 16-year-old girls that are 250 pounds having babies. And that causes problems, and we're making lifestyle choices. But when it comes to being ill or sick with something really bad, this is the place, maybe Milken, this is the place you want to be because we have great things like Milken, and also we have tremendous amount of innovation in medicine. If you go around the world and read medical journals, my wife is a surgeon, this is how I know this, and I go to a lot of medical conferences, every innovation is coming from the United States, almost every, not things like LASIK, there are a few examples where they're not, but certainly most examples, we are the #1 in medicine. And why are we? Why is it important to us? It's important because innovation, it destroys industries. That's the negative side of innovation. You know, when Henry Ford came out with that mass-produced automobile, all those horse and buggy guys were upset. When the radio was introduced, and that kind of came from Marconi in Italy, but it came here very quickly in 1920s, the people who performed in movie theaters, music, or people who performed live, they were threatened. When motion pictures, talking movies came along, after silent motion pictures, the people who performed in theaters went out of business. And television came along, the motion picture industry thought they'd be out of business. And certainly when the broadcasters, they were ignorant of the fact that cable came along, they thought it was insignificant, and satellite people came along, and cable wasn't paying attention. And the internet came along, and nobody was paying attention. But the point is everything that's come along has produced good and bad. The bad is there's not a lot of travel agents anymore. There's not a lot of people who fix typewriters or people who make telephone booths. So there's all these things which come along and they destroy all sorts of jobs. And that's harmful and hurtful, but that's America. And that's what happens with innovation. But we create all sorts of new things and new jobs.
This is Schumpeter and creative destruction.
Yes. I was trying not to throw around.
No, that's okay. It's an economic think tank. We can do that here. So, we also, our friends at the Kauffman Foundation have done a very good study that's shown relatively conclusively that firm formation is probably the greatest single driver of job creation in small to medium-sized enterprises, which, as we know at the Milken Institute, are really where the long-term sustainable job growth comes from. You're talking about today, and you're looking in the future, which, as we discussed before we came up to the stage, is actually what America's all about. But I learned a lot reading your book, and I want to just read something to the audience, because I think there's a historical foundation too, and it belies a certain degree of erudition. Next came the patent laws. These began in England in 1624, and in this country with the adoption of our Constitution. Before then, any man may rightly, instantly use whatever another had invented, so that the inventor had no special advantage from his own invention. The patent system changed this, secured to the inventor for a limited time the exclusive use of his invention, and thereby added the fuel of interest to the fire of genius. The fire of genius in the discovery and production of new and useful things. One guess who said that? Abraham Lincoln. Very good. Somebody got that right.
The only patent-owning president.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, he didn't do anything with his patent, but he was on a barge one day and he got stuck, and he figured out a way of lifting barges out in the future. I guess he's frustrated. Like, anytime I'm in an airport and I'm stuck, I have all sorts of ideas about how things should change. But he had an idea, and for your next trivia question with your family, you could ask, who's the only patent-owning president?
So there's a foundation in the United States, but where does the fire of our genius come from today? I think you did a very good job in your book talking about how immigration is critical.
It's not only immigration. I mean, what I love about this country is that every one of us has a story that goes back relatively short compared to other countries, in a sense of how many lines you have to go up. But almost every one of us came from people who came here with almost nothing on their back for a better life, and nothing to lose, really, frankly. Come here broke, as my grandparents did on both sides, and I'm sure along the way yours did as well. And they were diverse. We're the most heterogeneous country in the world, as I said earlier. Plus, we have a Constitution, which is unique. We have something called the First Amendment. The First Amendment is not only protecting the press, it's protecting anybody with an idea from expressing that idea and not being bashed down by the government because you have something different which threatens the status quo. As indicated earlier, the bad thing about innovation is it always threatens the status quo. You're always affecting someone else, and in their view, not positively. So you need the protection of the First Amendment. You need a culture of questioning. You need a society the way we have, an entrepreneurial society where success is rewarded. No matter what the tax code has been, it's always been that if you make money here, you can usually keep almost all of it or most of it. And there's arguments around the edges how much you have to keep to encourage innovation. And we also have a questioning culture. As President Obama said in the State of the Union address in January, after my book came out, our kids in school aren't taught by rote. They're taught to question. And when you talk to the Asian cultures, who are so frustrated that they're not as innovative as we are, it's a totally different atmosphere. They're homogeneous. They have to get along. You don't want to stand out. I mean, it's an anti-innovation culture, if you will. And I think, in a sense, because we're heterogeneous, because we're an immigrant culture, because we're still attracting the best and the brightest, or we were at least until September 11th, 2001, yep. We had this tremendous, the brightest people in the world. They came here because this was the place to be bright and succeed and have the chance to make it big.
But let's get back to this Asian point. We spend a lot of time in Singapore. We're actually opening up an entire Singapore operation of the Institute. Singapore is a place that takes its creativity and innovation deficit very seriously and has real performance metrics that it's instituted in order to, bridge the gap. And very specifically, they're doing it via the development of human capital, of course, the greatest asset. And they've got concrete human capital recruitment plans. So I don't know if I see that differential as that threatening anymore for certain Asian economies. Maybe not.
Well, certainly, part of what I talk about in the book and I talk about with you is that every country, every company, every person needs a strategy. Our strategy as a country should be innovation. That's our brand. That's who we are. We have the largest number of innovative companies in almost every area. Singapore, with about 4 million people,
4 million.
has a strategy which is phenomenal. They are offering companies, if you invest $300 million in Singapore capital investment, we will give it back to you in 3 years, cash.
Yeah.
They are attracting the best and brightest people from around the world. They have, you're right, they're focusing on capital, investment, and they're brilliant. But they're only 4 million people. Mm-hmm. And obviously, when I'm talking generalities, when I say Asia, that's a big generality. Mm-hmm. You know, Germany has a strategy. German strategy is precision manufacturing. They're proving that you can be a high-wage country and have manufacturing in automobiles, in medical equipment. And they're doing a great job. They're the strongest country in Europe. France, I was just there a few weeks ago talking before their business community about their strategy. And their strategy to me is based on the fact that they're a very sensual country. They have perfumes which you smell, and food which you taste and you smell, and fashion which you feel and you touch and you see. I mean, they use all the senses, and that's what they're great at. They're not great at manufacturing or a lot of other things. And they're very insular and protective. I mean, you can't even say Twitter or Facebook on the French radio because that's considered advertising. I mean, they're very protective.
Is that right?
That's a fact.
Wow.
You know, they're different. But, you know, we respect these cultural differences. And look, every country is entitled to pursue their strategy. I mean, they like strikes there. We don't like strikes here.
So let's get back to strategies. It's a good point. Does the U.S. have an innovation strategy?
You know, I'm starting to think we do. Again, if you go back to President Obama's State of the Union address in January, he talked about innovation and the American dream repeatedly. You know, we ended up with different conclusions, but in terms of a strategy, I think there is starting to emerge a strategy. And I'm not the only one pushing this, but it is Republicans have a innovation internet caucus. Democrats are focusing. I mean, it is bipartisan. It's something the parties agree on. Maybe that's why you don't hear about it, because it's not controversial. And the strategy revolves around, it's starting to revolve around the same things. You know, it's getting our hands around our financial future. It's growth through innovation. And while the Democrats may say we have to target certain areas like solar power or electric cars, the Republicans are saying we just have to make sure venture capitalists have money and we have a rewards-based society and we take away the roadblocks. I think there's starting to be a consensus, and I say this because the chairman of the Judiciary Committee came up to me holding my book and it was all underlined, and he said, and this guy is not a pro-immigration Republican, Lamar Smith, he said he's starting to see the light on immigration that are PhDs, that are educated. You know, it's one of the crazy things we do. We give people PhDs and we kick them out so they can compete with us. And at least in the hard sciences and math and IT, I mean, obviously that doesn't make sense.
Slide 15, please. So I think what you just hit on something very, very important. People are starting to see the light, and you're getting a diversity of opinion around immigration that you hadn't before, and we call it high value or investing in America. You know, why did you do this? Why did you undertake doing this book that you don't make any money from personally? You know, vis-a-vis government and innovation, because what it sounds like, what this strategy is emerging, but it sounds like a very organic process as opposed to one that's being driven for the good of the country, say out of the administration.
Well, out of fairness to the Obama administration, they are talking about this much more, especially this year. But you know, the other national events kind of always suck out all the air of the room and the focus and attention. But what I do believe is that you have to be part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And I'm passionate about this. I think I'm not an American that has served in the military. You know, we've turned our wars over to rural kids that are poor for the most part, and we don't experience this the way we did in Vietnam. You know, in Vietnam, it was amazing to me that the youth of America changed the culture. That's not happening today for reasons that I just can't figure out, whether it's, you know, they're entrenched in video games or texting or whatever. They just don't seem engaged on public policy issues at all. But somebody has to be, and you know, that's why I challenge all of you, engage, be passionate about it. And to me, why can't you be passionate about the future of your country with a vision for it that is, I hate to say it's not controversial. I mean, I've had the most conservative Republicans read this, and Grover Norquist signed the cover of it, is on a book jacket, and also liberal Democrats, and they agree. And if they disagree with certain things, it's at the very edge, frankly. And there are things in there which no one's going to agree with everything.
So specifically around policies, what are some of the policies that you're proposing that where you're seeing violent agreement or at least consensus around, and where are some places that people just don't seem to be able to see eye to eye?
Well, the basic agreement is we need a strategy as a country which defines us, and innovation should be that strategy. Once you agree on the strategy, how do you get there? What are your tactics or your goals or your objectives or to get there? And one is what I call strategic immigration. We spend all the time debating illegal immigration, which is not my thing, but strategic immigration. Who do we want here? How do we get them? Right now, we have this random pool for anyone in the world who wants to get in there, and we just pluck them out. And then there's this family thing, which you could argue either way, but that takes out most of the slots, and there's very little left over for the people who we should want. We should choose who we want in the United States. Why not? Every other country does. Second thing is trade. We're the only country that has not signed, the developed country that has not signed a free trade agreement in the last 5 years. We're the only one. Canada, Latin America, every Asian country, they are lowering tariffs to zero. Our exporters, our innovators now face a 15% or higher tariff when we export and when we import. And our numbers are scary, I know that, but you take like Apple. Apple is a US company, R&D here for the most part, components from all over the world, manufacturing in China. The Chinese complain about Apple. They say, we only have between $3 and $7 of a $300 product. That $2 billion of Apple products being sold, most of the wealth coming back to US shareholders, is being counted as if it's our trade deficit, when it's not. It's a great export we have. So the other thing, I mean, just having some economics training and being in Washington forever, is you have to question the numbers you read sometimes. And the truth is we're still a great manufacturer in high-value things, just not consumer products. And we're still doing a lot of great things. But I have worked in a factory. I don't know how many people have actually worked in a factory? Americans do not like working in factories for the most part, for highly repetitive work, maybe for train work. But I've done some really bad factory work. I've been in factories in China, in Japan, in Korea, in India, Vietnam, all over the world, and Mexico. These are not really good jobs that Americans would want. So our strategy should be more creating and innovating rather than factory jobs. It's important to have trade to do that. It's important to have selective immigration. It's important to have education. And we spend a lot of time talking about education. But education is the only profession in the nation now where you can be the worst teacher or the best teacher and you get paid the same. Mm-hmm. You can be the phys ed teacher or the physics teacher and you get paid the same. And that doesn't make sense, and that has to change. And I think there's a role for corporate America to play in enhancing education. But I think there's a role everyone can play. My father was a school teacher and a union organizer. And he was in a transitional neighborhood, and he was very frustrated because he said the number one thing in education is parents, and it's parental involvement in their schools and things like that. So we have to start accepting responsibility for that.
Are there any other elements to what it will look like a national strategy?
Yeah, sure. I have plenty. Want me to keep going?
Yeah, absolutely.
One of the, some terrible things happened in Washington today. I mean, in my world, terrible. So Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, has testified in Congress this afternoon. This morning, a whole bunch of protesters against Google, which just boggles my mind. Like, I went to Google executives' homes and did all sorts of not nice things and at the hearing, and which is fine. That's what Americans do. We could be creative in our protesting. But the point is, what we have now is we have the United States government attacking Google. We have the United States government attacking Microsoft, Intel, Qualcomm, and now Google. And gosh knows, there was talks about Apple, and gosh knows who else. I travel around the rest of the world. This is catnip for every other country to start suing them. And I was in France a few years ago. They're all looking to us and say, you are the most innovative country in the world. Tell us how to do it. And the Minister of Education stood up after I spoke and said, we want to be like the US. We're going to require every graduating high school person to have basic English skills and IT skills. And I'm thinking, wow, this is really great. The next sub-minister, the numerique, which I think means internet, stood up and said, we are going to go after those countries with their closed systems that keep us out of the marketplace. So the EU, France, everyone attacks our countries after we do. No other country in the world attacks their best companies the way we do, and it's very frustrating. We have a tax policy, obviously, which doesn't encourage investment here. And if you make money overseas, you have to keep that money overseas because you're going to be taxed on it again when you bring it here. So what do? Well, you can't hire the people you want that are the smartest and best. So you create facilities in Singapore or in China or elsewhere. You hire who you want, keep the money out, you diversify. And there's a lot to be said to be near your markets. I mean, diversification is a good thing for any, but you know, these essentially American companies are usually run by American executives. And they want to hire Americans, and we have a jobs problem. And then we do things which are rather crazy, and I don't want to offend anyone. We're like, right, what's happened in the last couple of months with Google and Boeing, where we shut down a brand new U.S. factory because it's in a different state. And this is an incremental factory. If you read the AFL,
how did that happen? I don't know if everybody understands what happened there, but that's really an important example.
AFL-CIO, I get their daily blog because I do, and the unions essentially in the state of Washington, working for Boeing, filed a complaint because Boeing was adding a new line. They've added several thousand jobs in the state of Washington, but they were adding even a new line for the Dreamliner, a new plane, to compete with Airbus. And they were putting it in South Carolina. Now this makes perfect sense to me because you always want to diversify. Look what happened in Japan with the floods and the tsunami and all that. And you know, if you have all your manufacturing in one area, you're very vulnerable. So it makes perfect sense to have something elsewhere. But there were some comments made a few years ago after 2 major strikes costing $3 billion to Boeing that, maybe we should be elsewhere. Some executives said one sentence, and that one sentence was said, you are retaliating against the union, and therefore that's why you're in South Carolina. And now this NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board, said, wow, that could be right. We are stopping you from opening this factory. The factory, they spent over $1 billion to build this factory in South Carolina. Over 1,000 South Carolina people were ready to go to work this summer, and now it just stops. Airbus people in Europe are very happy. How does it happen? We've lost our way as a country. We've lost our way when we don't focus on the fact that we're competing out there with other countries in the world, and we have to look out for ourselves. And we have to say what is really important in the scheme of things. What is important? Some things may not be that important. Some of the political correctness, some of these other things. This is a tough game. We're no longer number one, or we won't be very long, and we got to fight and compete.
I was in Russia last week, and I went to an economic development in the city that's going to host the 2014 Winter Olympics. And that city, Sochi, and it had 8,000 people from around Russia. It was sponsored by the federal government in a region that was seeking to expand quickly. 8,000 people. This is a federally sponsored conference connecting capital with innovative companies, with commodities-based companies. I have no idea what the actual output of that conference, how it can be measured in terms of economic activity and job creation, but I don't know if there's a similar type of event that really focuses on economic development, job creation in this country. So I travel a lot too. I see that competitiveness all over the place.
I actually, again, I don't mean to offend anyone here, but I actually divide Americans into 2 categories. Those who've traveled the world and those who haven't. And when I say the world, Canada and kind of Europe maybe don't count as much as going to some countries which are struggling and trying to, like India or others, build themselves up. And you realize that our success is not a God-given right. It's something we have to fight for, and not having plumbing and not having electricity. And soon we're going to have roads with a lot of potholes. And I mean, our budget's going to be tough, and we're going to face decline, and we haven't invested in infrastructure. The whole stimulus package, I think 6 or 7% of it went into infrastructure. So we are in decline, and that is harsh words, but it is a fact. And Americans that have traveled abroad know that. I cannot figure out why. I've been saying a lot of these things in writing. I've written 70 columns this year. I have a weekly column in Forbes, and I write for the Huffington Post. I have something today in the New York Times. And I say some really controversial things, including what I've said to you before and a lot more. I have not lost one significant member company. I've lost 2 individuals from my over 2,000 company membership. And the reason is because the people in my industry travel abroad a lot. And frankly, they agree with me. Or they're not paying attention to what I'm doing, and they're very nice, or they like me. Maybe they like my wife. I don't know, but the point is it's amazing to me because no one wants to hear that their country is in decline and not doing things right.
So I want to come back to the decline word. That's a big word. That's a heavy word. But I also want to call out an example from your book about the job stimulus as well. And I think it's near and dear to all our hearts because it's focused on Los Angeles. It's really about where the stimulus went. And this is This is from the Los Angeles Times, September 17th, 2010. I don't know if we all remember this. 2 LA agencies get $111 million in stimulus funds, but have created only 55 jobs.
What?
So, I mean, and this was something that Wendy Gruhl uncovered. So, you know, I think your point is that stimulus doesn't always stimulate. You know,
I would have taken it, you know, if you believe that you should select industries or companies or do things like that for jobs, my preference would be that the government, and I don't believe that, but if you do, the government should give money to venture capitalists. Venture capitalists should have some stake in the game. They should put up some money and get some return and let them choose. The way it works in Washington is these new administrations come in and there's some 26-year-old kid who has no experience at all making decisions on who gets money. And look, we just saw it with the right, the solar power company that got a $500 million loan and is now in bankruptcy. And it's gone. And now those workers are applying for further government funding, trade adjustment assistance.
So let's go back to the decline word. How's that message playing in Washington? You interact with senior members of not only the administration, but Congress. I mean,
probably more Congress, both parties, than the administration. This White House, honestly, has not been that open to criticism of any type. The fact is that the members of Congress of both parties, I'd say most of them understand, and if you ask what they're doing with their money, some of them maybe even putting it overseas. A lot of them understand we have a serious problem, but the problem is with members of Congress of both parties, and I will generalize. First, I want to say they're very well-meaning people, they're patriotic, and they'll give up so much to be in politics despite the fact that we always knock them down. They give up family time, family life. They're always subject to being put on the front page for something that people view as unethical, even though they try. Having said that, though, most members of both parties that are members of Congress are more focused on their party than on the nation. And they vote on the basis of the party than the nation. And, you know, with all these pledges from both sides, you know, and Democrats take the view that, oh, if we just tax the rich and we preserve entitlements, we're fine. And Republicans take the view that, oh, we really want to cut, but waste, fraud, and abuse will do it. That's enough. You know, both those views are wrong, and they're simplistic silver bullet solutions which don't really reflect reality. But we have voted them in, and that's what we've done. And it's not acceptable anymore. And this whole, whether you hate the Tea Party or you love them, they have forced the debate, and at least they're forcing some honesty. And I think it's a good thing.
Honesty among
Honesty
whom?
about the numbers, in a sense. I mean, the Washington Post yesterday ran an editorial about President Obama's announcement about his budget thing. And the Washington Post, one of the most liberal papers in the country, pointed out that the numbers don't add up. That, you know, he's taking $1 trillion pretending the war is going to end, and he's not solving, and he's proposing, you know, you want to tax the top 22,000 people in the country? Those are the people that are going to move out. You could take all their money, it will cover 3 days of the deficit. I mean, it's the rich, fine, tax them, but tax everybody. It's not going to solve the problem.
Let's get to another part of government, and you talk about it a lot in your book, which is spending. And I'd like you to really elaborate on the linkage between government spending and innovation. You know, what kind of innovation deficit does the current regime of government spending put us at?
Well, I mean, there's two. If you're talking about spending for innovation, you know, you could look at ARPA and the internet, and you know, the people who invented the internet essentially were very vehement that this was started with government money. And there's some obviously good things. The space program and even the defense program have spun off a lot of innovation. There's no question that that's happened. On the other hand, not having money means you don't have money for education, you don't have money for infrastructure, you don't have money to promote the U.S. I just spent an hour with a delightful woman who is doing a documentary about the fact that the U.S. had the least impressive pavilion at the Shanghai World Expo, and she was mortified. China being the, you know, fastest growing, definitely the largest country in the world, and here we are insulting them. So we are not investing in our brand. We're not investing in marketing. We're number one, and we're arrogant that people will come there. So it's a matter of what you invest in. And for years, we've just invested in, we've said yes to everyone. Now we have to allocate, and it's going to be really difficult the next several years as we allocate. I would argue we should be able to invest in innovation. And the basics of innovation, to me, is education, a good immigration system, things that encourage innovation. And we should measure everything we propose by where it is in terms of allocation of resources. And also, are we spending money on ourselves now, or are we spending money on our kids in the future? Which is a good defining point for all public policy. What are you really spending money on? Are we just trying to make ourselves feel good? And now I know it's very popular to say we're not going to touch Medicare, we're not going to touch Social Security, because everyone is focused on themselves. And maybe that's true. When over 50% of Americans are getting a check from the federal government, maybe that's true. I think Americans are better. I think if you bring seniors into the conversation and say, do you want to sacrifice for your grandkids? I think they would. And if you bring wealthy people in, say, are you willing to pay more taxes? I think they would. You know, I advocated that we extend the Bush, that we let expire the Bush tax cuts, which maybe isn't popular in this room either, and call it a war tax. If we're going to be at war, let's pay for it. Let's be honest. Let's sacrifice a little bit rather than just have kids risking their lives.
And how'd that do for you?
It wasn't the column I tried to share with most of my corporate members, but but it's, you know, our organization has never once asked the government for any money. Even in the digital television transition, I remember testifying before Congress, and Democrats and Republicans were like, what do you mean? We have to give you money. We have to, you know, consumers are going to be without television unless we spend billions of dollars informing them and giving them subsidized consumer boxes. And I was very consistent in my answers. I said, you know, honestly, this is just television. You know, you could turn on a radio if you don't get it. You can open a newspaper. You can call a neighbor. You're not going to die if you don't have TV for a few days. I said, why don't you, and I said this to government officials all the time and publicly. I said, you know, you should really be focusing on the mortgage documents people sign. They don't understand. Losing your house is a lot bigger deal. And Americans are not understanding these mortgages, I guarantee it. And, you know, it makes me feel good right now to say I'm right. But it's just frustrating.
So what's not frustrating? Where do you see the hope? You know, do you see any opportunities for business, particularly the consumer technology, high-tech industries, to educate Congress especially, and you know other parts of the federal government to unleash the innovation?
Well, the hope is that in so many segments, just not the internet and wireless technology, but in biotechnology, nanotechnology, robotics, we're still at the very, very beginning. There is a future which I can imagine, having read a lot of science fiction, but also looking at trends, and a lot of I know I can't imagine because I'm just not capable of imagining, where we have a lot in front of us. We're still crawling in this digital world in so many different ways. You know, the map, the gene pool, there's so many, healthcare, there's so many different things that are exploding and are ripe for bettering people's lives, for helping the economy, for creating jobs. And we're there, and we're positioned. As a nation, we're positioned, and as a world, we're positioned. It's not a bad thing, the fact that we're creating all these things here and maybe manufacturing them in China, which are helping the world stay connected and communicating and having access to information that even the wealthiest people 20 years ago just didn't have. So that's great. As a nation, I'm optimistic because I think there is a growing sense of consensus that innovation is an important strategy for us. And if we could say that's our strategy, and we can then debate how to get there, which is the way I think groups should operate, whether it's a family or a board or a country, is you define the goal, you agree on the facts, and then you debate. And with healthcare, with the financial reform, with a lot of things that we do in Washington, you come up with the solutions without defining why you're going or what you're doing, and there's never even agreement on the facts. I mean, the facts of healthcare.
Can you give an example on that?
Healthcare, the debate was moronic. It was, on the one hand, you had President Obama going out there saying that doctors are cutting off legs to get $50,000 from a diabetic when it's a $1,200 for 90 days of coverage either way, and no doctor would cut off someone's leg to get that amount of money. Surgery is a very low return business, and there's a lot of risk, and no surgeon makes a lot of money. On the other hand, you have Republicans talking about death panels, which was, it was a bipartisan thing that you have a right to talk about someone at their end of life, the most sensitive time. I mean, it was insane. So you had Democrats and Republicans just clouding the air with stuff that was irrelevant to the discussion, which was, in this great country, people shouldn't die because of a lack of basic health care. How do we solve that together?
Going back to something you said earlier, you talked about these three elements, three legs of the stool, if you will, and growth being one of the things that we could use as a real pathway out of the current economic season, my term, that we're in. Are there examples of that you've seen at other times in the nation's history, at other times in other nations' histories, of growth really leading us out of a period of economic discomfort, at a minimum to recession?
Well, certainly, I mean, whether it's the invention of the steam engine or the automobile or the post-World War II growth as we invested so much in our capital infrastructure for all the returning vets, housing infrastructure and otherwise. Well, I'm from New York, I apologize, but what Robert Moses did in New York, there's a Pulitzer Prize-winning book by Robert Caro called The Power Broker, which is phenomenal in terms of how they built up Jones Beach and the Parkway system and everything else there with the workers' programs. There is examples of government spending, infrastructure, or technology fueling an economy. But change is good, and I think change is something that Americans, again, are more willing to embrace than other cultures because it's in our DNA. So to the extent that there's new things coming out, that's a very positive thing. And of course, that drives the economic development. One of the things I talk about in the book a little bit is that when the VCR was introduced, okay, that was actually created here, but the Japanese picked up on it and commercialized it for consumers, and Sony introduced a product. The Hollywood community tried to stop its sale, and they actually succeeded at one point. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals held the product, the VCR, was illegal, and it went to the Supreme Court, and that really kind of started my career. I was fighting at the Supreme Court on this one case. It ended up being a 5-4 decision. It was argued twice, and 5-4. One Supreme Court justice made the difference in that product being legal. If that product had been illegal, we wouldn't have Apple as a company. We wouldn't have so many of the technologies we have, because innovation was allowed to thrive in a way without government chopping it off because of concerns of an existing industry, the motion picture industry. They were deathly afraid of it. They admitted they were wrong later on. They shouldn't have been, because it obviously produced a tremendous amount of new revenue for them in all sorts of different ways. But it's a natural, because any industry is always scared about something they don't know about that comes along, and that's why we have to always resist the temptation to say some innovation is bad.
Right. So before we get to Q&A, I just want to really comment on, and actually explore one of your last chapters, which is the need for a national energy policy in this country. Why did you include that in your book?
Because the publisher told me I had to. I'm serious.
It's the sequel?
Honestly, I didn't have anything in energy. I said, how could you ignore energy? I said, energy is not my area of expertise. But on the other hand, obviously, any American could observe the situation and say that, we rely too heavily on oil. It affects our politics, our defense. I mean, it's killing us. And anyone who's waited in a gas line or paid the price says, this is ridiculous. We got to do something better. It turns out that as of now, compared to 5 years ago, we have the world's largest supply of natural gas. We didn't know it, and everyone agrees we have to figure out how to take advantage of it. And oil is a tough situation. My proposal in the book is that we further raise the price of gasoline by 5 cents every 6 months for the foreseeable future and keep raising it, so that people know that this is what it costs us. I mean, Europe essentially has an extremely high price for gasoline. They have tiny cars. Of course, European cities are designed for tiny cars, or they're not designed for big cars. But we do things, as a company, we try to do some innovative things. We give every one of our employees $25,000 to buy a home in our county. It's in the form of a 3-year forgivable loan, because we have to change how we live. We have to live near where we work. But I don't know if it's fantastic, because I don't know if I want the government saying you must live near where you work, but I think there's nothing wrong with companies encouraging their employees to do that.
Definitely linked to better productivity, quality of life with family.
Well, that was one of the reasons. Yeah. In the Washington area, believe it or not, has worse traffic than Los Angeles, although you could debate that with me, but it is the #1 complaint that people have in that area, because we haven't made the investment there because it's so challenging.
So, excellent. So we want to encourage questions now, but please, as always, limit your questions to actual questions, not comments or speeches. Thank you. This gentleman right here, please.
Thank you. I've been in the IT and high-tech world, and I hear about innovations in this area. Do you see innovation in the financial modeling, the linkage that helps energize the innovation opportunities in this country? Because presently, I take a lot of my stuff overseas for funding.
Well, that's a great question because, 20 years ago, 100% of the venture capital was in the United States. And now it's less than 50%. Part of that is natural because we're a slower growth economy now than compared to some of the Asian economies. And you want to be near these big markets. But part of it is, when I haven't talked about our litigation society and our surplus of lawyers, there's so many barriers that have been put up in the last 20 years, whether it's the legal system, Sarbanes-Oxley, the difficulty of attracting the people you want. And there's so many things. But yes, that's an issue. And again, with an innovation strategy, some of that would just collapse. It would go away. Like, what can we do to make companies better? How can we favor companies that have equity over debt? Why do we favor debt? Shouldn't we favor equity? What's wrong with people sharing in the success of a company and getting stock? Why should we discourage that? What we want is flexibility in these high-tech companies. We want lots of companies formed, 1,000 flowers planted, and maybe some will bloom. That's what we want. And that all comes to the top from an innovation strategy on down.
This lady over here, please.
Can you talk about any innovation in government in this greatest country in the world? And it's sort of beyond me that people would applaud higher taxes when everybody admits that the government is doing such a poor job of actually justifying some of this spending. I mean, if they were more efficient, I'd be more than happy to give them a whole lot more of my money. But the way it's spent, and not just the programs, but the inefficiencies in offices, is there any innovation coming out that would help make that more transparent and open and sort of force them to get a bit better at it?
I read a survey today which the average American thinks 51% of the government money is spent correctly, meaning 49% is not, and 49 cents of every dollar. And that's down dramatically from just about 10 or 15 years ago. We used to pride ourselves, with the pride of the space launch and all these other great things that we've done, that government spends money wisely. Part of it is that I've dealt with government a lot. It's very frustrating. I can spend a lot of time talking about how it's obvious to me that government wastes money, especially even the last 2 years, especially, honestly, because there's so much of it flowing. It just doesn't matter. But there is innovation at the state level. I'm very impressed with what a number of state governments are doing. I'm impressed, believe it or not, there's a new position that President Obama created called the Chief Technology Officer, Anish Chopra. And he has done a whole bunch of things in terms of open sourcing solutions to problems. We've developed a lot of things very quickly. There are a lot of good examples. I wrote a column about innovation in government, and it was talking about how the FBI has an app. And when I first heard it, I shriveled thinking, oh my God, the FBI has an app. What could it possibly? But it was good. It's actually so parents can put in there the vital statistics on their kids, their photo, everything like that. So if the kid's ever missing, they have immediate communication without, when you're so upset to try to find a photo that's recent. I mean, it's just difficult. So there's a lot of good stories, and we're always very critical of ourselves. And there's a lot of bad things in government, but there's a lot of great things in government. There's a lot of dedicated people, and we have to remind ourselves of that. Bill Clinton on Monday spoke, and he said something which hit me pretty hard. He says, we're the only country in the world which views our government with such disdain and doesn't even think so many of us doesn't even think there should be a government. And he's right. On the other hand, I don't know, we have higher standards maybe, and our government isn't doing what it should. And there's a civil service union thing there that's a little frustrating, I think we're starting to see. And maybe the personal experiences we've had.
This gentleman over here, please.
Would you make an attribution that there's less innovation in the 21st century than there was in the late 20th century? Or is that about the same? The top 20% in both eras produced all the innovation versus now we have outside competition and outside growth, and that's what's really the problem. And it requires a different solution than just saying we need to all be more innovative.
Well, certainly, first of all, you have to define innovation, and I define innovation wrongly as something that people are willing to pay for. Someone in government pointed that out to me because government innovates as well, and And that doesn't include government innovation. It may not include education innovation. I mean, there's so many areas of innovation that are right. I don't know how to compare and measure. I do believe that competition is very healthy. And as Americans, I think we have to get the mindset that we're in competition. And that will help produce. And also, there's a lot of evidence that when there's companies around an environment that are innovative, it produces more innovation, essentially. Clusters of innovation, as it's called.
Gary, he looked at me because we've done work on that at the Institute, actually.
I knew that.
In the back over there, sir?
You talked a bit about education. Could you comment on recommendations you have on how do we get teachers to be more innovative, and then how do we teach kids how to innovate so when they come out they can actually perform the kind of jobs the companies need here that you talked about?
I think President Obama has done some good things in terms of trying to have competitions between the states, and I'm not sure how political it was, whether they voted for him or not, but there was competition there. There was some, obviously the teachers' unions that put their needs before the kids, it's gotten a little extreme. And I recognize that they're all people and they want some economic security, but I don't know if we can afford economic security anymore because when our kids are at stake. What is happening, though, the technology is helping foster innovation in a whole range of ways. I had lunch yesterday with the head of the Video Games Association, and he talked less about the entertainment value of video games and more about the educational value and how in corporations and in schools, kids are increasingly learning by playing games. And I actually believed him. So, there's on audio tapes, well, I don't know if any of you have done the best courses in America or done those audio tapes or videotapes. There are great teachers out there. They do inspire, but they could also do it through technology. The question I have is in 20 years, will we have as much live teaching as we have, or will there be interactive programs using fuzzy logic in a sense which allows, a 3D or a holographic version of a teacher to interact with a kid and respond to what that kid's doing? I mean, it's all foreseeable, it's all doable. To get the best way and figure out how we learn, I mean, it's all, we could do it. And there is a lot of innovation, I think, in education, but we have barriers that are just because we've always done things this way. The curriculum hasn't essentially changed in the last 50 years. And especially in the math and science, and I would say electronics area, and IT, we have to do a better job. And we also have to, and I want to add one thing to that, because it's not in the book, but it's a theme I'm starting to figure out, is that for some reason we think everyone has to go to college. And we have too many people in college and not enough jobs for them. And what's wrong with technical schools? We do need electricians and plumbers and people who know how to fix things. And it's crazy that we don't recognize and appreciate them.
You talked about Germany earlier. Germany has, as you pointed out, a precision manufacturing strategy for its economy. And Germany has very strong guilds and trade unions that actually take students from the secondary level through their entire careers, through post-retirement, and on a journey as tradespeople and craftspeople. And and it works extremely well for that culture. We might have something to learn from them, for sure. This gentleman back over here, please.
Great session.
Thank you.
My question is, are you allowed to talk about pros and cons about the merging of AT&T and TMobile?
Yes, I'm allowed to talk about almost anything, actually. And I want to say, I noticed, and I say this with the greatest respect, that many of you are here, English is not your first language, and this book is dedicated to you. Because, as I say in the dedication, it's dedicated to all the immigrants who came here and had to learn English. You've given us so much. And you've made our nation great. And I don't think we often recognize that, the important role that immigrants have played in our success. AT&T, we actually, our organization has an official position, which actually the government is actually, I think we're the only ones who won at this point. And that is, whatever happens, the government should do something quickly. The antitrust laws are very ambiguous. I think when you are a business in this country, you have the right to know what the law is. You shouldn't have to go beg your government for some interpretation of law to proceed as a business. And you know, I'll tell you, I was reading all the Washington newspapers on the plane here today, and they're full of ads by AT&T, by Sprint, by Verizon, by other drug companies, all begging, saying why a merger is good or bad, and trying to sell the government in Washington on it. What's wrong with that? Why should you have to question whether a merger is right or wrong? It's either right or it isn't. And there should be clear standards. So I am frustrated that our antitrust laws are so ambiguous that allows our country to go after our best companies, that businesses don't know whether what they want to do is legal or not. In terms of the merger, I think the merger is good in that we have a severe spectrum shortage. And I haven't talked about that at all, but it's a vital important about, there's a chapter in the book, and so we are selling these smartphones now that use 25 times the data that the phone did 5 years ago. And we're selling these tabs, like the iPad and others, that use up to 120 times the data rate. We are going up against a cliff, now in terms of spectrum. Now some of this is going to be met by short range, so Wi-Fi is going to be everywhere, and that's what a lot of the carriers are counting on to carry all this phenomenal traffic so you could have full motion video anywhere. But the other part is we need more spectrum. Now there's a proposal, we are running ads on it this week as an organization in Washington, that would allow broadcasters who now have fewer than 10% of American homes are relying on an over-the-air signal, 10%. It used to be 100%. And they are sitting on a huge amount of spectrum. It's totally underused. You know, they have, with HD and digital transitions, they could be much more compact. And we want to give the broadcast permission actually to auction off their spectrum to people who provide wireless service. Because it doesn't look like the AT&T deal will go through. Now AT&T is going to have to pay $3 billion if the deal doesn't go through. So they must have good antitrust lawyers and they think it will. But there's a hearing date has been set. Today a judge announced that I think February 13th or somewhere around there's going to be a hearing. But what a slow process. The XM-Sirius merger was one which I don't know if any of you care to remember. But it wasn't how the government went either way. They took a year and a half to do it. The XM lost 2/3 of its stock value. The whole market froze. No one would buy anything. And it's the same kind of thing here. Government has to do a better job of laying down the law and saying what it is so you know whether you can go for it or not. You shouldn't have these protracted processes and ambiguity in the law. In fact, I'd say that's true of all laws generally. You should know whether you're violating the law. We have too many laws now.
But as a Washington insider, how much of this is driven by the political philosophy, or in the words of your book, habits, of the administration when it comes in? So does the Department of Justice have to just turn on a dime, and do you turn the aircraft carrier?
No, that's not it at all, honestly. What it is, mostly in my view, is that there's big battles in Congress, and politicians get money from both sides, and they don't want to hurt either side, so they compromise in something that's totally ambiguous. And then they say that ambiguity will be determined by the executive branch. The executive branch comes in, they try to do the right thing, and it's ambiguous. And part of what our standards should be is that we should have clear laws. And we don't. We have increasingly unclear, lengthy morasses. 2,000 pages of the health care bill. I think it's similar for the financial. No one knows what it means.
You quote Congresswoman Pelosi in your book, saying why she felt we needed to pass the health care bill so we could understand what was in it.
She did say that. And not only that, she rushed it through in 48 hours. No one read it. She got a ruling from the Congressional Budget Office that it would reduce the deficit. And I immediately spoke up publicly and said it's not correct, and here's why. The Congressional Budget Office has corrected their numbers significantly since then, and we keep finding out about more ways. But yet, if you go to the White House website, you will see it cuts the deficit. It's fraudulent. It doesn't cut the deficit. It's several $100 billion additional.
Back here, this gentleman, please.
I really enjoyed this session. It's fantastic.
Oh, thank you.
My background is semiconductors. Innovation is very difficult. It takes tremendous amount of time, long attention span. Your career is very turbulent. And I quit semiconductors. I started up in Northern Cal. A couple of questions. Values and innovation. As you know, Bell Lab gave away all the patents and really created the semiconductor industry and all of that which evolved other semiconductors. A lot of technologies today are embedded into semiconductors, but they gave away the patents. The Human Genome Project wanted to patent human genome, take it away from the market. Number two, we had a lot of financial innovation in the last decade, which has taken us to ruinous. So how are the values play into this? And finally, what are the enemies of innovation?
You're right about the semiconductors certainly containing a lot of innovation, and Bell Labs was a great national resource, which sadly is no longer here. But we have a lot of other national resources, and you have other companies which emerge, whether it's Google or Apple or Intel, invests a huge portion of the revenue in the future, and they keep their best stuff here. So I don't worry that much about semiconductors. Your second question.
I'll take that one. Financial innovations.
Oh, go ahead.
I'll take that one.
Thank you.
So, I mean, regarding financial innovations, I think that we have a saying here at the Institute that complexity is not innovation and leverage isn't or wasn't credit. So I think it's very important to distinguish instruments that actually create access to capital and instruments that layer on complexity and also increase opacity as opposed to transparency.
Or you can look at another, to put it in simpler, no one, what we're going away from as a culture is a sense of responsibility, in my view, it's never, the toughest, and the Wall Street Journal is going to have something, I'm saying about this in the next week, it's basically we don't apologize to each other anymore. And I like the Japanese, they say they're sorry when they screw up. And in my own world, I'm always saying I'm sorry to my wife and to my employees. And it's not the worst thing in the world to admit you were wrong. President Obama gave a speech in Holland, Michigan a couple of weeks ago, and he gave 12 different excuses why he hasn't succeeded, from Japan and oil price, and yet to apologize. And by the way, Republicans don't ever, there's a rule among politicians, you may never apologize. But the fact is that we have to take responsibility. And in the financial crisis, I'd say we were all responsible. All of us got those mailings every day, 12 a day, refinance, do this. We knew it was funny money. Politicians of both sides were trying to get housing for everyone. The ratings agencies, certainly. Journalists did a terrible job. I hold them responsible. So the financial collapse was something that we all played a part in.
And the last question was, what are the enemies?
The enemies of innovation are always the status quo. Anyone who's threatened, that's the enemy of innovation. I mean, the good thing for the U.S. is that we're a change-oriented society. We like change, we like something new, and that's who we are. But you're hurting someone there potentially.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. This gentleman here.
Yeah, I think you just touched upon it.
Can you use the microphone? Yeah, thanks.
I think you just touched upon it, but I still want to delve into it. When you just were talking about the whole issue with real estate and the mortgage situation that really threw the whole world into the mess that it's in. And James Colville made some comments the other day that was in the news. And one of the things that caught my attention was when he asked the question, he's talking to the White House, really. He's asking the question, when is somebody going to go to jail for what happened?
I think we all feel that as Americans. I mean, there's nobody that's responsible yet, and I agree with you. It's tragic. And S&P, they downgraded the U.S., but where were they a few years ago? And why? I just don't understand it. I mean, there's a great book by the guy who wrote Liar's Poker called The Big Short, Michael Lewis, and he talks about, and I buy his view of what really happened there. And I mean, it has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, but there is an explanation, and S&P bears a lot. Yes, the ratings agencies certainly, they were the ones that kind of everyone, well, it's AAA, it's AAA.
16,000 of those instruments were rated AAA. There are three AAA rated companies in this country. So 16,000 financial instruments were rated AAA, and more than actually, and there are 3 AAA rated companies. I think we have time for one more question about innovation. This lady right here, please.
I guess, I don't know if this was referenced before with the enemies of innovation, but I was just wondering if you addressed the risks of innovation and how that would go into the strategic plan.
The innovation, there's a lot that failure is very important. I think failure is wonderful because we're the only country in the world where you hire, when you interview people, often you ask about their failures. And if the interviewee can't talk about any, then they're not being hired, especially in Silicon Valley. So failure is very important. Risk is very important. I mean, the truth is this solar company that went under is not such a terrible thing because companies will go under. It's a good thing. But I guess the question is taxpayer money investing? That's where it gets complex. But failure is so important. And one of the things we've gotten away from as parents, essentially, is that it's okay for kids to fail. It's painful for the parent, but it's important. We've gotten to a society now where every kid has to be a winner. No kid could take any criticism. Every kid has to get an A. Competition among teams, there's no winners and losers. Scores aren't kept. And that's not who we are. We are a competitive culture, and there are winners and losers. And the important thing is, I got a question at one of these events a few weeks ago, and someone said, well, what about the 50% of Americans that are below average?
That's a great one.
But the truth is I really believe that the mind is like an attic. And there's only so much storage space, and everyone has just about the same. Some people could fix a car. I can't. Everybody is good at something, and that's what they should do. So the point is you have to find out what people are good at, what they're passionate about. That's how you inspire them. That's how you should orient them towards a career. That's how you should educate them. But some people are risk takers. Now, what there is there's a generational difference. And I wrote a column recently about how one of our great untapped resources is our older people who have a lot of wisdom, but they are now put in companies, and they kind of, almost by our system, they're encouraged not to take risks because they could lose their job, they could lose their pension, but yet they have the wisdom, and they should be part of the skunk teams, and because they have so much to go forward on, but they're often stopped because they don't want to take risks, and we should encourage them. But young kids that have nothing to lose, they're the ones taking the risk. They're the Mark Zuckerbergs, and they're the founders of all these great American companies. But we're the only time in our history, essentially, where with a broadband connection and a computer, you could create a multinational company overnight. It's a great time to live in, to be an entrepreneur, to be a risk taker, and to move forward. I think that's all the time I have. I really, I'll be staying afterwards. I really want to thank you for taking the time to listen. I think this is so important. If you get anything out of this, you don't have to worry about buying my book. You're welcome to, but do something. We have something called the Innovation Movement. So we had 130,000 Americans sign up. It's innovation-movement.com, I think, or .org. I should know that. But anyway, just Google Innovation Movement. And it's free. And basically take a position. Move your country forward. Do it for your kids. That's all I ask.
Well, thank you for your leadership and your service, Gary. Thank you.
Well, he may not want you to buy his book, but we want you to buy his book. So it is for sale right over here, and he will sign copies right over here in just a few minutes. Thank you.